Hi guys, Bass is here, and welcome to my basic Fury Warrior DPS guide for patch 8.1, the Battle of Dazara lore. As I'm sure you can gather from the title of the video, today we're just going to be sticking to the basics for the most part. We're not going to be going over anything too in-depth or too crazy. In this video, we're going to be talking about talents, rotation, stat priority, which Azerite pieces you want to target on your gear, and all that fun stuff. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Starting off with the talents, in the first tier we have a couple different options that just increase our rage generation, and Endless Rage is going to be our go-to choice because it just offers us the most single target rage generation out of the three. The only time you're not going to want to take this talent is if you're out, for example, in a dungeon or world questing and you're able to chain a lot of kills together. If you're able to get one kill every 10 seconds or so, War Machine can be on par with Endless Rage or even pull ahead. So if you hit that threshold, you might want to consider taking War Machine for that niche example, but for the most part, just roll with Endless Rage in this tier. The second tier offers us some extra mobility and utility. Double Time is the standard choice in this tier, just with the extra mobility and rage generation that it provides. It makes it a really strong talent. But obviously, if you need the burst healing from Impending Victory, or if you really need the stun from Stormbolt, you can obviously take one of these talents. So in this tier, for the most part, just take whatever you need for whatever content you're doing. But like I said, Double Time is usually the default go-to option. In tier 3, we have some talents that serve to spice up the rotation a little bit and give us some variety. Sudden Death and Furious Slash perform very similarly on single target, but Sudden Death will usually get the edge just because it's a little bit less clunky to use, especially in AoE situations. And with Sudden Death, you don't have to worry about the debuff falling off or anything and losing DPS like you do with Furious Slash. So while they perform pretty similarly, Sudden Death is just a whole lot easier to use, and that's what gives it the edge in this tier. So you should probably roll with Sudden Death. In tier 4, your choice is going to come down to either Bounding Stride or Warpaint for the most part. If you need the mobility for a fight, then go with Bounding Stride. And if you don't, then the damage reduction from Warpaint is probably going to serve you better for the most part. In tier 5, we have 3 talents that affect our Rampage ability. Carnage is going to be the go-to choice in this tier just because it reduces the cost of Rampage, allowing us to get more of them out throughout a fight and therefore increasing our time spent enraged. And Rampage is a very important part of the spec, so anything that allows us to get more Rampages out during a fight is going to be a huge boon. The only exception when you're not going to want to take Carnage is going to be if you really need the burst that Frothing Berserker provides. But for the most part, Carnage is an awesome talent. You're going to want to take it most of the time, if not always. In tier 6, the choice is going to come down to either Dragon Roar or Bladestorm. Dragon Roar is typically the preferred option since it is stronger in terms of single target and frequent AoE. But Bladestorm is better for burst AoE, so if an encounter really hinges on that, then Bladestorm might be the better bet in that situation. But for the most part, Dragon Roar should be the default choice in this tier. Finally, in tier 7, we have 3 options that improve our burst. Siegebreaker is probably the best option out of the 3, just due to the fact that you can cleave it with Whirlwind onto multiple targets. That makes it very strong, especially coupled with something like Dragon Roar or Bladestorm. But it definitely adds an extra little layer of complexity to the class as a whole, and especially to your burst windows. So if you're newer to the spec and you want one less button to press, you might be better served just going with something passive like Anger Management or Reckless Abandon. Reckless Abandon is the strongest talent in terms of just straight up raw burst, so if a fight really hinges on that, you might be best served with this talent. But for the most part, I would suggest Siegebreaker for most situations. It's a really fun and awesome talent to use. Before we get into the actual rotation, I just want to take a second to explain the Enrage mechanic, because it's a huge part of the spec. It's essentially the core of DPSing as a Fury Warrior. So basically, becoming enraged increases your haste and damage by a significant amount for a few seconds. There are 2 ways to become enraged. The first of those is by using Bloodthirst, which has a 30% chance to enrage you. And the second is using Rampage, which costs 75 rage, but it has a 100% chance to enrage you. So whether or not you're enraged is going to influence which abilities have priority in your rotation, because your goal is always to maximize your time spent enraged. So with that being said, the single target rotation for Fury is a pretty straightforward priority system that I'll put on the screen now. And after we go over the priority system, we'll go over it in a little bit more detail just to kind of break everything down and explain what's going on. So you'll want to Rampage while not enraged or above 90 rage, Recklessness on CD or when burst is needed, Siegebreaker during Recklessness or in between its cooldown, Execute while enraged, Bloodthirst if not enraged, Raging Blow at 2 charges, Bloodthirst on cooldown, Dragon Roar while enraged, Raging Blow, and lastly, Whirlwind as a filler if nothing else is available. So I know at first glance that might look like a lot, that might seem kind of confusing, but when you break it down, it's actually really simple and straightforward. So essentially, the bulk of what you're trying to do is just use Rampage when it's available, keep Bloodthirst on cooldown, prevent Raging Blow from capping at 2 charges, and using your Execute and Dragon Roar abilities while you're enraged when they're available. You want to make sure that you're not using those abilities unless you're enraged. Outside of that, you're just going to use your Whirlwind as a filler if nothing else is available for you to use. Lastly, you're going to want to make sure you're using Siegebreaker and Recklessness on cooldown, and based on their respective cooldowns, you should be able to get 2 Siegebreaker casts off in between each cast of Recklessness. Some other notes on Recklessness: it is our only offensive cooldown, and it gives you a slight boost to your critical strike chance and increases your rage generation by 100% for 10 seconds. Its main benefit is the extra rage generation. So while it's active, you have to be really careful not to overcap your rage. You want to make sure you're dumping your rage on rampages very frequently. Probably every second or third cast should be a rampage while Recklessness is active. One other thing about Recklessness: since it doesn't directly increase ability damage, there isn't really any major benefit to holding it off to save it with other offensive cooldowns like Dragon Roar. Siegebreaker, it kind of lines up nicely with organically, so you don't have to worry about that as much. But for the most part, if you have an ability like Dragon Roar or Siegebreaker available and Recklessness isn't up for another, say, 10 seconds, don't worry about saving it. Just use them on cooldown. You don't have to worry about lining them up with your Recklessness. It's not worth it in that situation. If you're saving it for a burst window, for example, or if they're only a couple seconds off, like 2 or 3, then by all means save it and line them up. But for the most part, you don't have to worry about lining them up. It's not really any benefit. You're going to be better off just using them on cooldown. So as far as what this actually looks like in practice, I'll give you an example of what a typical opener might look like. So as long as you're not using Furious Slash or Reckless Abandon, you're better off actually just using Recklessness before you charge in. So essentially all you're going to do is just pop Recklessness, charge in, and then just continue using the ability priority system that we already talked about. As far as AoE is concerned, Whirlwind allows us to cleave our next 2 single target abilities and up to 4 additional targets. So essentially, in a multi-target situation, you just want to make sure that you're weaving in a Whirlwind after every 2 single target abilities to maintain the buff. Outside of that, you're just going to stick to the normal single target rotation. For burst AoE, you want to Whirlwind to gain the buff, use Recklessness, use Siegebreaker, which will cleave to multiple targets through Whirlwind, Rampage to gain Enrage, Bladestorm or Dragon Roar, whichever you have talented, and then Whirlwind again to gain the buff and just continue cleaving with your single target rotation. As far as Azerite traits are concerned, there are a few very strong ones that you should keep an eye out for in your gear. These include traits such as Treacherous Covenant, Reckless Flurry, Cold Steel Hot Blood, which is important, we'll go over that one later when we talk about stat priorities, Unbridled Ferocity, and Simmering Rage. As far as middle ring traits go, Overwhelming Power, Heed My Call, and Gut Ripper are the strongest. There's a very useful website called Bloodmallet.com, which lists the sim DPS of every different Azerite trait with 1, 2, and 3 stacks of the trait. So it's a really helpful resource that'll help you figure out which Azerite traits you should be using based on the gear that you have available to you. Just keep in mind that the value of these traits can shift a little bit for your character depending on what gear you have equipped or what other traits you have equipped. So while this is a really helpful website, the best way to figure out what gear you should be using is always just to sim your character. If you don't know how to do that, I'll post a link in the description that'll help you out if you want to look into that and learn a little bit more. But with that being said, this website will give you a pretty decent idea of what traits you should be shooting for or what traits you should be using. So just like with the Azerite traits, the exact weight that a stat has for your character isn't necessarily going to be the same for everybody. It can change based on what other Azerite traits you have active or what other gear you have equipped, stuff like that. So it's a really good habit to get into simming your character, just so you know exactly what gear you should be on the lookout for, what stats are the best for you. But just as a general rule of thumb, if you do have the Cold Steel Hot Blood Azerite trait, Crit is going to be your most important stat, followed by Mastery, Haste, Versatility, and then Strength. Whereas if you don't have Cold Steel Hot Blood, Crit is going to fall down to in between Haste and Versatility on that priority list. Lastly, I just want to touch on some abilities that might not necessarily be part of our rotation or anything, but are still very important for us to know about. So first, we have Enrage Regeneration, which is our main defensive cooldown as Fury. Just reduces the damage we take and makes our Bloodthirst heal a little bit more for 8 seconds. Outside of that, we have Rallying Cry, which is essentially just a little heal for our raid. It's a very useful utility spell in a raid environment, so don't forget you have that. We also have Berserker Rage, which lets us get out of Fear, Sap, and Incapacitate effects on a 1-minute cooldown. Outside of that, we have Battle Shout, which is a buff you want to have applied to your group at all times. Don't be that guy that forgets to buff your group. We also have Piercing Howl, which is just an AoE slow. It's obviously not going to be super useful in a raid environment, but just be aware you have it, just in case there is that niche situation where slowing an enemy will help you or your group get out of some hairy situation you found yourself in. We also have, in a similar vein, Intimidating Shout, which is an AoE fear. So obviously that can be really useful, but just keep in mind that using it has the potential for mobs to get feared into other mobs and just make a bad situation worse, so just be really careful about when you use this ability. Lastly, we have Victory Rush, which lasts for 20 seconds after you get a kill. It isn't worth using in our DPS rotation, but it does have a nice 20% heal attached to it, so just keep in mind that if you're low and you see that button is lit up, you're able to use it. Don't forget that you have it at your disposal. It's a nice 20% heal, and it's come in clutch for me many times. So with all that being said, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video, guys. I really hope that you learned something or you found it helpful. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you left a like or considered subscribing. It means more to me than you know. Outside of that, if I realize that I forgot something in this video or if any of the information becomes outdated, I will post a comment down below or post something in the description. So before you take off from the video, I might suggest just taking a quick look at the links in the description or in the comment section just to make sure that nothing glaring is out of date or anything like that. So like I said, with that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. See you guys.